Research Associate at the Africa Research and Impact Network, and also the regional coordinator for the coordinator for the regional dialogues. Just to highlight, as Maham has rightly stated, that ARIN, it's an international think tank, comprised of over 200 researchers and policymakers, and with a significant portion of the researchers being policymakers, around 30%. And the network fosters a dynamic environment where researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, who work across come and exchange knowledge and expertise. And this explains our passion for getting African scholars, think tanks, and all other key actors to genuinely rethink Africa's climate finance on, what is working, what is not working, and what has been explored, tested, and what can be scaled, and vice versa. With excellence towards that end. And just to dive into, the main agenda of the convening, we have to accept that across Africa, the climate finance question has lingered for too long in familiar corridors. When you talk about capacity building workshops, proposal write-ups, and well-intentioned attempts at accessing multilateral funds, all that has been done. The gap that is consistent, and the gap that still hurdles Africa's efforts towards sustainable financing mechanisms, it lies around not exploiting other innovative avenues for private and public funding mechanisms and strategies. So this inaugural North Africa regional dialogue, I may say it invites us to look beyond what has been tried and proven insufficient, and to confront what truly stands between Africa and the resources it needs. We gather here, not to rehearse old narratives, but to interrogate the new ones that we hope to get from these conversations, to explore emerging innovations, to question uncomfortable assumptions, and to ask what forms of partnerships, leadership models, and institutional transformations that will finally shift, Africa's efforts in climate finance. So from this dialogue series, I may say is therefore more than a technical exercise. It is innovation it's an invitation, if I may put it that way, to be courageous, to be candid, and to craft a continental pathway that truly works for our local communities. I believe together we will examine innovations that are emerging across sectors, test ideas that may be uncomfortable, that have never been tried before, and ask fundamental questions about the roles of loans, grants, private capital, and cross-regional partnerships. What right forms of partnerships works best for Africa? See, and I'll just end by saying that may the deliberations, be thought-provoking and inspiring, and above all, may it, push us closer to a climate finance landscape that is not only um, accessible, but genuinely transformative for the continent. And I'll just say that also the insights that are going to be drawn from this process will feed into the third annual Climate Finance Conference in Uganda next year. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Washington, for this great introduction and very energetic. So to introduce myself and the team, my name is Mirham Kilig, and I work in Ain Shams University as an assistant professor in urban design and planning department, with a genuine interest in climate change challenges facing Africa and in African challenges overall, and also for looking for similarities across Africa, which I always see as beneficial, energetic, and really interesting and fruitful. So for today, this is our first convening as we have been introducing. Sorry, just to introduce the team, I have Iman and Anas with me who will be working on the report coming out of these convenings. So thank you, Iman and Anas.
Hi everyone.
So for our first convening today, our aim is to understand the role of stakeholder partnerships in facilitating mobilization, management, and utilization of climate and NDC finance in Africa. So we'd like to explore more about stakeholder partnerships spanning governments, private sector, civil society, development banks, and communities, and how to strengthen the mobilization, management, and effective utilization of climate finance in North Africa. So for that, we'll start with our first speaker for today, Muhammad Kamal, who is the Executive Director at Greenwich Foundation based in Egypt, who will be focusing on the democratization of climate finance, aiming to put communities at the center. Muhammad Kamal has been engaged in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee since its inception, aiming to ensure the appropriate coverage of the needs and challenges of the Global South. He also holds an MSc in Water, Sanitation, and Health Engineering from University of Leeds. So, Mohammed, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meham, for the introduction and for having me. Since I've already been introduced, I'm looking forward to try and share some of my insights on how we can localize climate finance, and maybe I can give a bit of context on my expertise in the subject specifically. So I've been working on finance-related negotiations for, let's say, 4 years, but I've actually only been intensely involved for the past 2 years, and I've been more involved in the multilateral environmental agreement space than climate per se, but they are very linked, as most of the funds are revolving around the same negotiators and countries and donors as well. And you can clearly see a reoccurring pattern of challenges related to the multilateral process and also to the financing space, the banks, the funds, etc., and the challenges they're facing and the challenges that countries and communities are facing in accessing finance. So my presentation will largely focus on trying to give insights on two key things. One, why is it hard for local communities, local actors to get climate finance? And two is what could we do about this and how can we go about it? What are we actually asking for in some of the negotiations happening now, whether for new conventions or existing conventions? Just a very quick overview that we are still very far away from having of accessible financing. Most of the climate finance is very much still loans. Non-concessional loans are the majority, and most of the financing goes through entities that are not necessarily accessible for a lot of communities. They're mainly accessible for governments, and governments usually centralize their efforts in some of the development projects that they do. So as you can see from this breakdown as well, one of the key things that usually stands out is the percentage that is taken by the middleman entity. So when you calculate the amount of money, so I think this was the OECD report in 2022, they had reported that we have reached the $100 billion dollars target of committed climate finance, and they had their own breakdown. But a critique of that report came from an Oxfam report a year later, which argued that they did not take into consideration the actual money that reaches the adaptation or the mitigation project on the ground. They just compiled all the costs, which includes the cost of operations and the cost of the multilateral development banks or implementing entities in the middle. It's a very big challenge, and it plays a role in why we struggle to access accessible financing, especially on issues such as adaptation. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but this is to give you a general reminder that we're still in a space where most of the financing is non-concessional loans, and we're not sufficiently close, remotely close to the amount of grant-based financing needed. So to put it simply, most climate impacts, if I'm to focus on, so I'm from Egypt, and most of the climate impacts that we have in Egypt, bearing from one or two, are very locally focused impacts. They're very felt by the most frontline communities, by local villages or small communities that are usually decentralized in their modality of governance and decentralized in their geography as well. However, finance is not decentralized. Finance is more majority centralized, whether from the decision-making element or from the disbursement element. And the way the projects are designed is usually, and obviously it's easy to critique any side, but they're usually tailored towards something where there can be a lot of control for the implementing entity and also the implementing entity, whether the one receiving the funds or the governmental entity implementing the project as well. Historically, this has also been the case for development projects. So the traditional social development sector has had a very similar, let's say, trend where most of the development efforts are centralized through governments. There's a common African trend. If you go back in the past 40 years, you'll find that most development projects were central from the government, regardless who's the financing entity, whether it's a World Bank or any other form of development financing agency. And the planning can then, depending on the governance within that country, either become slightly decentralized or remain centralized. And largely, the way we even define decentralization differs from one geography to another. But most financing flows through a central entity because of the planning as well. So the planning remains central, the financing also remains central. So, and this is largely a top-down approach, which has slowly changed, let's say, for the past 30 years, and how the NGO space, the civil society space, is starting to get its own financing. Let's now go to another very important point, which is now so acknowledging that the frontline actors, they're the ones feeling the brunt or the very first tangible impact of climate, but they are not at the very top priority of where financing flows. So how can we do this? How can we shift this? How can we find a way where they can get direct access or where they can get simplified access? In red, what I'm trying to point out is the key argument against decentralization of funds has usually come from our own governments, where they are worried that if you provide these modalities, they might compromise the country's sovereignty. And you cannot blame them. There is historical precedence for this. But at the same time, there is sufficient infrastructure at the national level of actors, of projects, of even institutional structures that can exist where the country can be involved in the decision-making process, in the monitoring process, without necessarily needing to be the middleman for the financial sort of transfer from whomever the donor is to the frontline community. Unfortunately, though, because of general worry on how donors, usually being developed country governments, are going to utilize such a funnel, this is a step back is usually taken, and these are not very well utilized, especially in regions like North Africa. To simplify things, because I'm going to go to a very quick slide, we have three forms of finance, in my perspective at least. We have public, private, and blended climate finance. Private is largely coming from entities where there is no government decision-making involved. It's usually individuals or companies. Public is fundamentally based on governments, and we're going to focus a little bit more on public. And then blended can be sometimes quite problematic, but it's also smartly a mixture of different forms of financing, including things like bonds, conditional financing where you, for instance, do a debt swap and then based on the performance in the debt swap, you can get a grant or you can get a loan, etc. Now, so because I don't have a lot of time and probably there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A, I wanted to focus on three examples of, let's say we have a community. Let's look at two examples. We have a community, for instance, in the north of Tunisia or in the south of Egypt, for instance, that in the south of Egypt, you have an annual heat wave that we usually expect in June and July. And in this period, you can argue that the trend has shown that there's clear increase in intensity of the heat wave. So a community like this might want to adapt. They might want to increase their resilience. Or the local municipality might want to have a small grant to improve its healthcare resilience or capacity to accommodate more heat stroke or heat stress patients that might happen during a heat wave. So, what are your options? Well, your first option is to go to your government and to ask for funds or additional support from the Ministry of Health and Population in Egypt. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Health is already under-resourced and heavily challenged, a very common theme seen in most developing countries anyway. So the next path would be to request this. Here, I'm reminding you, I'm speaking as a local municipality. So this is going to be a district or a municipal district within a governorate. And you want a certain pot of money to improve your healthcare capacity. One other path that you can go is to go to a local NGO. And here, this is really important, and it's very common as well. A local NGO might have more freedom in using its resources than a local governorate, even though a governorate might have more money and supposedly a bigger budget. And you would go to the local NGO because they might even apply for funds or be able to just provide a certain amount of money for an activity. And then the third option is to go to a UN agency, which is very common. You would go to a UN agency or they would come to you or any other development agency, the GIZ is an example, and you can co-design with them a small initiative or find one of their projects that you can jump on. Now, where would those agencies get their money, right? So if you're a UN agency, if you're working on a climate project and a community came to you, or you went to a community, or you did your own mapping and you found the impacts that communities are facing, you most probably will prioritize the GEF in Egypt, at least. So the GEF is the go-to sort of fund, let's say, or facility to get financing for climate and environment projects in Egypt. The GEF has a lot of issues. I'm an outspoken critical person of the GEF. I'm not a happy person with how the GEF replenishment cycle works or how the co-financing requirements work as well. And also there is limitations on how much you can design your projects. Also the limitations and the sort of the financing absorb of financing that happens from the accredited agencies that have to get the funds, such as UNDP, UNICEF, etc. However, the GEF does have the most money and it has the most grant financing available. In context of Egypt, most of the resilience projects, coastline resilience projects, or even heat resilience projects have come historically from the GEF, but fundamentally centralized. They're all partnerships between government and UNDP, and the GEF is financing them. Now, I'm not going to critique them. I would critique the GEF because the GEF structure in requesting the financing is very, very centralized in how it requires you to fill the form itself. It might require you to include elements of how you will make sure that communities get the financing, but taking into consideration the timeline for applications and some of the burdens that governments have to face in filling the forms, you start to realize this is probably not going to happen. They're not going to have their strategy unless the government already has its own way of decentralizing funds. So in the GEF, one way that community can get its money is through the small grants program. The small grants program, the maximum amount of money you can get is $100,000. If I want to increase the healthcare provision capacity for a hospital, I'm looking at the very least, even if it's a small health unit, $400,000 to $500,000. So the small grants program is not very relevant. So let's go to the next option, which is adaptation fund. Also, Merham, if I'm going over time, please let me know because I'm not looking at any other, if you've sent me any message, but hopefully I'm nearly finished. The adaptation fund is designed to be more accessible. It's easier to get direct access for national entities. So for instance, in Egypt, you could have the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency to become a national implementing entity. However, that's not the case at the moment. The concept is that the government can get direct access, not the local community. And the adaptation fund is fundamentally grant-based. GEF, in contrast, is grant-based, but is an enabling grant-based, meaning a lot of GEF projects are trying to enable a project or an entity to get more financing, usually loans. At least that's what we have seen in Egypt. And what you usually get then with the adaptation fund is there's a longer process for application. There isn't a lot of national implementing entities anyway. In Egypt, I believe you have the FAO and I think you have UNDP. I'm not sure about other North African countries. And the size of financing available is very limited, right? So you're more likely for the adaptation financing you need as a country to not waste a lot of time. I mean, bearing in mind that the politics play a big role in this, right? If I'm a Ministry of Environment, if I'm a minister and I want a project, I have 4-year term, and then I'm going away, I'm not going to go through a 4-year application. The next minister is going to benefit from this. And I understand that might seem like, well, it's for your people, for your country. Huh? That's not how politics work. So you're most likely going to go to a bank. You're most likely going to go to a quicker disbursement modality. And because of this, we usually do not capitalize on things like the adaptation fund, which is already under-resourced anyway. So if you're a local municipality in the adaptation fund, you can actually write a proposal, but you're probably not aware of that. You can send it to the national implementing entity, and the national implementing entity, which in this case will probably be a UN organization. Some East African countries have registered national organizations and agencies. In Egypt, there isn't at the moment, or I think there was one in the process, and they can apply for you. So again, that's not necessarily direct access for a local community, but you could say close to a form of decentralization. Let's get to the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is probably the best at mobilizing financing out of all three being presented. But the Green Climate Fund fundamentally provides you grants to enable you to get a loan. That is the simplest way I can sort of give my perspective on the Green Climate Fund. There's a lot of money in the Green Climate Fund, a lot of flows and how they organize things. But the local community from the Green Climate Fund is very unlikely to get access to that money or that pot of money. It's much more likely through modalities like the Adaptation Fund and the GIF. So how can finance flows be more localized? How can we decentralize them? Taking into consideration that things like the GIF and adaptation take time, they're designed to be centralized. That means I have less than a minute, and they're not very accessible. So let's focus more on government. The government needs to, in its national annual budgeting, start to incorporate needs. Some governments have started to do this in Africa, not all. And in Egypt, we definitely have not started doing that. I think in North Africa, I think the only country that has taken a shot might be Tunisia, but I could be mistaken. My colleagues can correct me. Is to actually set the governorate level or the municipal level needs annually. Then you start to get clarity on financial needs. And then you can actually start to empower those actors with that clarity, and they can start to know, oh, we need this much money, where can we get that support from? And then reach out to the development partners that can get you that form of decentralized financing. Grant-based performance financing is probably very relevant to the context of NDCs and NAPs if you want to achieve certain targets and indicators. I am not a very big fan though, because if you want to decentralize and empower stakeholders, you don't want to constrain them too much. You don't want to increase the reporting burden. It's one of the reasons entities and national entities at the local level, not at the national level, avoid getting in trouble with this. And the third, I would say it's the third one because I already mentioned the last one. The third one is very important, which is having actual direct access. I think this was a discussion in the Loss and Damage Fund board where they tried to discuss how can local communities, not necessarily countries or municipalities, get direct access to loss and damage financing. There needs to be more innovative pools of funds that don't require layers of approvals, that can be small in nature, but can provide direct access to individuals or groups and CSOs, and put the criteria you want, and governments can be involved in decision making. It cannot be considered direct access if it requires approvals or processes in the middle. It needs to be direct in the sense where they apply and get a response, and that response can involve a board of some sort that can take collective decision and have the involvement of government. Happy to take more questions on some of these suggestions, and hopefully this was a useful reflection. I know I took more time probably than was allocated.
Thanks a lot, Mohammed. That was very insightful. Thank you for your presentation. Before we go forward with our second speaker, does anyone from the audience have any questions, or shall we go and postpone the questions for the Q&A?
I guess let's postpone them better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so please, if anyone have any questions, you can pop them in the Q&A chat box, or you can unmute and then we can share your question during our discussion later. So Now, with our second speaker, Zainab bin Ahmed, who is a senior climate finance analyst at Climate Policy Initiative. She will be focusing on reforming climate finance architecture for equity, accountability, and impact. Zainab is a climate finance specialist at Climate Policy Initiative in Washington, D.C., where she supports international financial architecture reforms and helps public development banks scale up climate finance. She also leads research in innovative financial instruments. Also, Zainab holds a master's degree in economics and public policy from Harvard Kennedy School and London School of Economics. Please, Zainab, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. And thank you so much, Mohammed, for the great as well insightful presentation. And I feel my talk is going to be very, very much connected to what Mohammed has said. So I hope it's going to be complementary. Let me share my screen. Do you see my slides? Okay, so I'm not going to go through the introduction since Mahram did a very good job. So let's start here. I'm going to start by a simple but striking number, which is climate change could consume in Africa up to 80% of its GDP by the end of the century. And of course, we are already seeing the effect and how it looks like. So for example, the continent is facing one of the worst droughts in 500 years. Temperature is rising, and sometimes it's rising to 50 degrees. And 8 billion was lost in just a single year in 2022 due to climate shock. Tiny country, Tunisia, has seen, because of flood, 300 million lost in damage. And of course, climate change is not these localized shocks. They hit an entire economy. They hit budgets and, of course, the livelihood of millions of people. So what is holding us back to invest at the scale that meets that urgency? So I'm going to present three main financing barriers. But it's also important to say and reiterate that Africa not only has the resources, but also the human capital to invest into its climate and resilient growth. So what are the three main financial barriers? One, the finance gap is enormous. Africa needs around 200 billion every year to meet its climate goal. And today it's attracting only 20%. And worse, all of that finance is concentrated in only 10 countries, which means it's leaving a lot of countries, specifically those that are vulnerable, behind. And even more concerning, it's not only the lack of finance, but the type of finance. And as Mohammed has pointed out, we rely too much on debt, which is the second main financial barrier in Africa. In fact, more than half of climate finance in Africa is loan, and usually in hard currency. And in a region that is vulnerable, for example, 21 African countries are at high risk of debt distress, which means they have a little room to invest and to borrow more. So when we compare it to, for example, Asia or Latin America, we realize that Africa relies 2 times more on debt for climate projects than its counterpart. And of course, the cost of capital within debt is a major barrier. So for example, African projects can borrow or can face a borrowing rate up to 7 times higher than their OECD counterparts. And the third barrier is the private sector. So the private capital is limited. The Africa world. And when we go and we also see like the domestic capital, we see a similar picture. In one hand, we see that if we combined African banks, pension funds, and insurer together represent 2.4 trillion in assets. And yet they only account 2% of all climate finance. And why is that? One reason is because the African risk premium are overstated. It is important to highlight that there are real risk. We talk about few bankable projects, FX exposure, evolver regulation, but also many of the biggest barrier comes from what we call perception-based risk, which is the idea that many still hold Africa as this single block of high risk, which is a very outdated view. Because in reality, there is actually low default rate in Africa. Many African countries have financial system that is stable, and also many countries that have a strong credit profile, including Morocco, Kenya, South Africa. And a simple example, so for example, the same solar panel in Germany will borrow at 8%, and that same project in South Africa will borrow at 25%. And this difference, it's not explained by the risk of the project, but by the perception-based risks of the countries. So what can we do to do things differently? Every single actors here have a very important role to play. And of course, happy to explain a little bit more during the Q&A. First, the government. The government has a very important role in the green African economy. One, it can protect national budget from the heavy economic and social costs. It can mobilize local capital by engaging more the domestic investors, for example, by issuing more green bonds, by putting in place regulatory reform by supporting fiscal incentives. It can also empower more Ministry of Finance, even though this is like more central planning, to develop a comprehensive financial strategy that link project risk, climate, and different type of financial instrument that go beyond just debt. And of course, they can leverage the role, the very important role of National Development Bank. So for example, at CPI, I work closely with Uganda Development Bank, UDB, because they set up a climate finance facility with the support of the government to provide affordable local currency financing for its sustainable and climate project. But of course, the government cannot do this alone. So too, the private sector has to see climate as a growth opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier, the opportunity is huge. Africa has 60% of the best solar resources in the world when it comes to the adaptation sector. When it comes to adaptation sector, the global adaptation market is valued at 2 trillion annually. And this, for example, in terms of the investment in the water system, resilient housing, smart farming, etc. Africa has one of the youngest workforces. So just imagine if a fraction of the African pension fund were invested in this project, in, for example, the solar project or resilient infrastructure, we can completely transform the situation. And lastly, the development partner. The development partner also have a very important role to play, not to make the finance bigger, but smarter. As I mentioned earlier, and also as Mohammed mentioned, over half of the climate finance come in the form of debt, and mostly in hard currency. So the DFI can help the African countries to prevent or to minimize the green debt trap. By, for example, by providing more grants, more equity, more guarantee instead of new loans, by taking on more risk and specifically currency risk. By working with more local financial institutions, even though they don't meet the AAA credit rating, they can also scale more financial instruments that are innovative, like debt for climate swap or risk sharing models. So just to say, I'm going to close here by saying, if each of the stakeholders play their part, the African story could be very different. We can imagine a future where Africa is no longer at the margin, but really at the center of the global green growth. It's already a continent that is rich in renewable potential, critical mineral, human capital. So if we get the policy right, if we get the finance smarter, we can move from a climate vulnerable continent to one that is exporting energy, mineral solution, from one that is no longer a resource extraction model, but one that has an added value creation, where our African youth is integrated into the global economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Zainab, for this insightful presentation, perspective on financing, and special thanks to sticking to the time. It was
Of course.
spot on, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, so maybe we can move to our guests for today, last but not least. Iskander Erzini Vernot, the director of the Email Initiative for Climate, focusing on the regional enablers of NDC financing. Iskander is the founding director at the Email Initiative for Climate and Development, the first independent nonprofit climate think tank in North Africa, headquartered in Rabat, Morocco. Iskander oversees the management of the organization while engaging with all stakeholders relating to the climate crisis. A diverse background in climate policy, sustainable development, energy systems, adaptation, loss and damage. And he also holds an MSc in environmental policy and regulation from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So, Iskander, the floor is yours. Thank you for today.
Thank you, Dr. Mirham, and to colleagues for their contributions. Thank you also for the introduction of myself. To introduce Email, obviously, with the first climate-focused think tank, to my knowledge, in North Africa, established a few years ago. So we were pleased to be invited by our colleagues at ARIN, Research and Impact Network, to co-host today's discussions. So providing some reflections on the state of regional cooperation and how this can relate to the climate finance agenda, as well as providing some thoughts in reaction thus far, and maybe drawing some abstract conclusions before we open up and general discussion that will follow. So, I mean, I think we are probably all on this call aware of the unique vulnerability of the North African region as one of the most vulnerable regions in the world when it comes to climate change impacts, as one of the most regions in the world, if not the most water scarce region. I'm here in the lovely city of Rabat, where it's been raining, but don't let that fool you. We face existential challenges at both national macroeconomic levels, as well as at the community levels with households, pastoralists, and farmers in the region. So there's all of that, and then of course there's the context of the mitigation side of things, where the energy transition, I think, creates unique risks and opportunities for both in terms of the transition away from fossil fuels as well as the transition toward renewable energy. And in this immense climate finance challenges, which in many ways is akin to the story of the rest of Africa, where we have all of these aspirations captured in NDCs, but a lot of challenges in meeting those finance needs. So I think we can understand that we can look at this problem in different ways. Climate finance, as mentioned by colleagues, exists at a micro level, and it can exist at the level of municipalities, subnational actors, the national actor, and the national level, and then finally, of course, at the regional level. We'll look at what we can, how we can aggregate some of these challenges that are faced. I think one of the very interesting things to consider that maybe unlike in other parts of Africa, where maybe in some of the other discussions that have been happening across, maybe colleagues have been reflecting on the importance of the regional economic communities or and the role that they've played, whether it's like ECOWAS or others. These may be important actors in other parts of Africa, but I think it's a great example of why it's important to not consider Africa as a monolith, because in the North African context in particular, these entities, and in North Africa we have the Arab Maghreb Union, have, I think, historically it can be said, not fulfilled their full potential and have been in many respects dysfunctional. And part of this is because of a, shall we say, historically fragmented region politically that has suffered from political fragmentation, in many ways ones which are legacies of the colonial era, and which you see manifested today in divisive issues around that touch on important issues of national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and just very tense issues for some of these countries, which have unfortunately held back the agenda of regional cooperation and regional integration and regional financing efforts. So, in fact, I would say, in some sense, because of this, regional climate cooperation and its financing in the North African region, and I would say that it takes two interesting, rather than regional economic communities. I think we have we benefit from a on the one hand our proximity to Europe and Mediterranean cooperation, and then on the other hand we have the important role of the wider Arab region and Islamic cooperation, and particularly the role of the Gulf states in the North African context. So if I just was to characterize the former in terms of the European climate cooperation, it often takes a bilateral dimension, precisely because of some of the challenges around regional fragmentation, as mentioned earlier. Have a union for the Mediterranean for some years now, but it is not a genuinely meaningful multilateral space when it comes to implementation. They do not have financing, and instead you have an important role played by European bilateral aid and development agencies and European DFIs, as well as the development banks, where the European countries have a predominant shareholding, like the European Investment Bank increasingly, but also historically the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So I think you have important actors in this regard, but is it actually operating at scale? I think the answer is probably not, in terms of the common challenges that we face. So, sorry, I can hear some background noise. We might want to make sure everyone's on mute. And then I think with respect to the Arab regional and Gulf-led financing, I think this takes different forms in different countries, depending on the political economy of the country in question. But in general, I think it has to be said that these are largely driven by commercial rather than developmental logics. So instead of development agencies and development budgets, in this case, these are driven by sovereign wealth funds and well-capitalized companies that these sovereign wealth funds back. So essentially looking for commercially viable opportunities in sometimes climate-related sectors, not only. So it could be water or in energy, notably. But of course, these are sort of subjected to the logics of what makes commercial sense for these investors. Although sometimes wider political considerations come into play when it comes to the relationships that bind some of these countries at a political level, and so sometimes that's a part of it. I think. So with that said, in terms of the regional dynamics, just to offer a few reflections, also based on the discussion before closing and opening up the discussion. So I think it's important to reflect on the realities and the experience that we have now of some 20 to 30 years of climate finance in the region, what's working and what's not working across mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage as the three key areas. I think on mitigation, we can say that increasingly, with advances in technologies, of course, we have commercially viable projects, which means that there's a role finance, and indeed Zainab alluded to a lot of this. But I think we also see from experience that within this, public finance still has a very important role to play in essentially getting things to move faster and also helping to create markets. And also to some of the issues that Zainab mentioned around perceived risks financially, you have public finance which is able to demonstrate proof of concept and demonstrate that risks are indeed perceived and that in actuality risks are not as great as might be otherwise supposed. So it has that opportunity to be a first mover and thus a market maker. I think the opportunity space is huge, but and when I say the opportunity space, I mean the opportunity for catalyzing private capital markets as envisioned by Zainab. But it's not happening. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is it not happening? Despite this having been a kind of a refrain and a narrative for for many years. And when I say it's not happening, I mean it's not happening at scale. And we have obviously examples in the NDCs which attest to this. In Morocco's case, and you'll note that not all of the North African countries have come up with new NDCs at this point. But if we take the example of Morocco, you have important ambitions on aspiration, like tripling renewable energy capacities by 2030, and also phasing out coal by 2040. The former relies on private finance, essentially in an unprecedented way, to deploy solar at rates which we haven't seen yet. And then the latter requires the coal story requires international support and likely different forms of public finance. So we have a lot of private finance actors in North Africa. The capital markets are fairly deep compared to other parts of Africa, but they're not always able to find the commercially viable, risk-adjusted returns that they're looking for, and projects that meet their criteria that are also climate projects. So this is a consistent theme. Big investors, including ones that are pension funds like Zeynep alluded to, but they are quite clear that they don't feel like they have the opportunities that they want to invest in that meet their fiduciary responsibilities and their criteria, even when they have sort of non-market level expectations in terms of return on investment. This problem is only aggravated when it comes to adaptation, where in general the projects that we're talking about are very often not revenue generating, like desalination potentially. You still do face important challenges. There are some examples of public-private partnerships in that case, but in general, it's challenging, and you can look at various case studies, I think, of MDB financing in this area, where from the standpoint of the sovereign and governments, because at the end of the day, adaptation is very often about public benefits. I mean, there are lots of opportunities for private adaptation benefits as well. But if you're a government, you face important challenges as a Ministry of Finance in terms of limits to your borrowing, in terms of the cost of capital, as others have alluded to, and the difficulties as well. So all of this means there is an important role for some of the blended finance that Mohammed Kamal alluded to, but it faces challenges, including in the availability of international climate finance to help to bring down the cost of capital. I don't want to take too long in the interest of time, although we could go on for longer. But on loss and damage, there you have communities, including farmers, pastoralists, and so on, that essentially are facing losses to their livelihoods and property and so on. So it's really not about commercial finance at all. It's about public finance. It's about compensation. It's about making amends. We do have some interesting examples and discussions around the role of finance from a insurance point of view. But even there, we're not talking about commercial insurance if we want to meet these loss and damages in full, because again, we're talking about communities and actors that are not able to pay for, and it's not just to expect them to pay for insurance. So what we have including in Morocco, is interesting examples of publicly subsidized insurance using public money for instruments like what's known as MAMDA in Morocco. But in general, what we're talking about is bill has been pledged for that fund, and yet, as has also been mentioned, in countries in North Africa alone, you face losses and damages of over $1 billion. So clearly, international cooperation is not fit for purpose. So just to close my remarks, I would say that yes, North African countries have an important opportunity in terms of mobilizing their private finance and capital markets. They can and they absolutely must. But we have to also be cognizant of the limitations of that agenda, as well as the reasons why, politically speaking, interests in the global north and so on have been emphasizing that way of doing things because it's convenient for them in a context where politically they're being made to cut their development aid spending and so on. So I think we come back to the need for international cooperation, but also reform of the international financial architecture around issues like debt and tax, to be able to assure that North African countries and African countries in general can obtain the affordable as well as grant-based and concessional public finance that they ultimately require. So I hope that's useful by way of further reflection, and I'll pass back to I think Dr. Mirham for the next component of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Skander, for your presentation and also for the concluding remarks. I think you tried to capture some lines from the different presentations that we were introduced to today. Thanks all, and I would like to open the floor for any questions from the audience directed to any of our speakers. And yeah, we have Iman.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Great. Hi, thank you all the presenters for the amazing information. I want to direct my question to Zainab. She said a statement that resonates with me so much about people perceiving Africa as a single block of high risk. And this is an outdated view. So sometimes the barrier between flowing the green finance is not only technical, and it's not the lack of the, sometimes it's in the image or in the perceiving of the people. So if this is an outdated view, how do you think we update it? So is it a solution that is technical, or it's data, or it's policies, or who should lead this shift? Is it governments or communities? I need to focus on this, please. Thank you.
Sure. Should I answer right now, or like you want to commit some of the questions and
I wish that you can answer right now.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. No, I think this is a very good question, and it's unfortunate that it's still continuing to impact, right? Like something that is so real, which is the cost of capital. So one way to think about how to overcome this challenge, and there is like a growing as well request for it, is, for example, how the credit agency are no longer to be positioned in the Western cities, but actually move to Africa, or we have our own local credit rating agency that can help with the data, with the objective quantifiable metrics to assess our risk instead of like just narrative. So this is one of ways where we can think about how to overcome this challenge. Yeah. And thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Leah, would you like to unmute yourself? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think I've learned a lot. My question is again pointed towards Zainab, and I'd like to ask, perception-driven risk keeps capital expensive. So we've seen, for example, 8% in Germany, vis-a-vis 25% in South Africa. What interventions would you introduce to narrow that spread? And ideally, who should be paying for that first loss tranche? So yeah, it would really be interesting to know that. Thank you.
I think it's very much linked to the question before. Again, I think it's very important to go back to the concept of perception-based risk, which is basically the idea that the cost of capital is not rooted into the micro risk. It's not rooted to the actual project fundamental, but how the investor is perceiving a country or a sector. And this problem arises because of, as I mentioned, outdated views, informational gap, track record. And again and again, the investor rely on this outdated sovereign credit assessment. So, one way, as I mentioned earlier, is this engagement of credit rating agency to reflect more the recent performance. But also we have to do our part, right? Like we need to make sure that we presenting the right data, we are as transparent as possible, we do our reporting well. But yeah, like this difference of cost of capital is very important, alluding to the country and specifically the way that we think of the country behave. So better data, better transparency, better risk assessment from our part, from the international actor part. How can we think about less colonized view of this institution and more engagement with localized agencies, specifically the role of credit rating agency?
Thank you, Zainab. Iskander and Muhammad, would you like also to comment on this question? I think this might also relate to your experiences. Okay, so maybe later, Anas, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Maybe I have some troubles with internet, but yeah, I my best. I have just one question to Zainab, please. As you say, and as you mentioned, international actors who are interested to finance this climate initiatives. Is there any South-South cooperation in this side? Is there any Chinese contribution to this, or only we're heading with the European and American partners? Because I mean, the Chinese way of doing is different from the Western way of doing.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question. The South-South collaboration matters a lot to support the climate finance because, as you mentioned rightly, there is this peer-to-peer learning, not only on project, but risk regulation reform. It's also important to mobilize the capital from peer-to-peer because also they are less subjected to the perception-based risk that I was mentioning before. It's also important to strengthen our collective bargaining power when we think about our industrial policies, when it comes to how to export our critical mineral, our resource, our energy. So definitely there is a room and we should do more, specifically when you think about the question of how can country develop. It's about transferring technology. It's about this industrial partnership. And this has to be grounded in the local value creation. So South to South collaboration is absolutely needed and encouraged 100%. Now, how can we make it happen is basically the question. I think our country, we need to do a better job as well to create this relationship. And again, like move away from the legacy of colonial historical economic linkages that we have with the European or Western countries, and creating as well, like this is perhaps more on the ideological side, but the in concrete side, how can we create this kind of like mutual investment, this co-financing approach to make sure that these policies are actually being established. But absolutely, to support climate finance in Africa or in the global south, the South-South collaboration is absolutely needed.
But do you have any example of actual, presence of South Coast collaboration in North Africa? Or do you have anything in the top of your mind? Or because we know
No,
China is in Africa, but is it that prominent in North Africa as well?
yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's not something that I studied very extensively, specifically North Africa. We see, for example, in South Africa, Namibia, they are doing like this corridor for green hydrogen. As you rightly mentioned, there is this relationship, very, very increasing relationship in China when it comes to the renewable investments in Africa. But North Africa, my understanding is that it's still, unfortunately, a region that there is a lack of economic integration and things needs to scale up. Maybe going back to also Mohammed's point of view, maybe this can be scaled up with more decentralization process and less central planning, but it's not really a subject that I have an extensive knowledge on.
Okay,
Um,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zainab. I would, if I can, I will just end with my questions. I have to address one question to Mr. Iskander, sorry. I want to know just the Moroccan case study. I know that Morocco is still struggling with the national strategy for desertification, and for the 8th successive year, Morocco is facing a very high drought season. Why all this interest now in climate in the Moroccan case study? If you have any updates about that.
Yes, I mean, I can speak to that briefly. So, I mean, the issue of water in Morocco has been a totemic issue for not just climate policy and climate governance, but for policy and governance in general for many decades. And there's all kinds of histories to be discussed there. But I think this is in a context where the country historically is agrarian. So when you had major droughts in the 1980s, these are catastrophic for an economy for which agriculture is the main employer historically, as well as a big source of not just revenues in terms of exports, but also foreign currency, which is essential for servicing foreign debts. So it's really a wider challenge, which the government recognizes is central. In Morocco, we have both large-scale industrialized agriculture as well as small-scale smallholder farming and pastoralists. And obviously, the former has better access to finance than the latter in terms of their ability to get commercial finance and credit and so on. But I think, obviously, from a policy perspective, it's not just about measuring the significance of policies and finance interventions in terms of GDP. We also have to look at employment and livelihoods of people on the ground. So I think it's a great example of how you have adaptation and loss and damage, and you have limitations there of what can be financed. You have, as I mentioned, some investments where you have public-private partnerships with desalination on the coasts, where you have some agricultural regions that are going to be benefiting from this desalination in terms of new water for irrigation in a context where there isn't enough water to meet the expectations of the agricultural ambitions. But these coastal desalination opportunities and financing structures behind them are not going to bring finance to the other side of the country, where farmers and pastoralists are inland on the other side of the Atlas Mountains, and facing very basic issues of lack of well water and so on. And my colleague Said Skunti, actually, who's on this call in the audience, can also speak to some of that further, where you need different types of finance at the community level. Communities are not able to issue bonds in this, certainly in the Moroccan context, and so you need to think about different types of financing to build their resilience, particularly with grant-based finance. And this is in a context where, if you look at what the private sector is doing in terms of Morocco's banks, even the banks that are focused on agriculture, like Crédit Agricole, also have difficulties in, again, to my point earlier, seeing the project pipeline and project origination for them to invest in a way that's that makes sense. And it's not just always about perceived risk, because in this case we're talking about a financial institution that's on the ground and that perceives the risks arguably better than anyone, certainly much better than international financial institutions. But even they face challenges, and it's again not just about risks, but about even the fundamental suitability of projects, which is why you need public finance to come in for public benefits. Just to briefly touch on, because it was asked earlier about examples of South-South cooperation. So I mentioned the role of Gulf Arab states in North Africa. This is very significant, probably the most significant in terms of South-South finance. But I think one very important example to also bear in mind is the significance of some of these Northern African countries in terms of wider African climate finance and financing of development, because you have a very important role played by countries like Morocco on a South-South basis, maybe also to some extent Egypt, but notably with Morocco's finance sector becoming a very important investor in the West African context. So you have this South-South intra-African, not intra-regional, but intra-African, inter-regional investment that is happening. And it's quite important. And in some instances, in some Western African countries, we've even seen the Moroccan financial sector overtake, for example, the French financial sector in being an investor in these countries. And that is in many ways, I think, due to the fact that there is that proximity bias and that lack of perception of financial risks to the same extent. So I think this is an important area of opportunity to support some of these regional centers for green finance. But I'll stop there, and happy to come
Thank
back
you,
later.
Iskandar. Yeah. I think building on this, can we discuss more, or do you have any other models or experiences regarding the localization and decentralization of finance flows to empower actually frontline communities and also ensure the inclusion of marginalized groups like women, youth, indigenous people? How would they actually access these climate finance flows if we are all speaking about these challenges on the international and governmental level? But what about accessibility of the vulnerable communities to the funds. Do we have any successful models? Would you like to share with us? Maybe Muhammad Kamal, would you be able to help us with some successful models from North Africa, if you have?
Sure. Maybe also to reflect on the previous discussion, I
Mhm.
think for North Africa specifically, I mean, when you look at the financial flows coming in terms of climate finance, a decent portion of this is going to energy, and is predominantly coming from Europe, with the exceptional, in Egypt at least, exceptional Chinese finance. And also there is Gulf finance, especially in Tunisia. I think there's two projects. There's one project in Egypt also from Gulf-based companies that are supported by sovereign funds and government funds. We're not seeing the same trend in adaptation. We're seeing it in mitigation because it's much more bankable, I guess, and it's much more focused. So if I go to the question, I think let's take it country by country. So if you look at Egypt, my experience working on climate now for the past few years, the most accessible forms of financing are ones that have the least amount of work required to get the actual money and are based on some form or a system of trust, and have a proper monitoring system in place. Meaning, there is this general perception where you're, I don't know, having a very big report or a very big audit of some sort somehow means that you are doing more impact, or giving, or the actual, like, it gives trust to the system or the process. But in actuality, when you look at the target demographics we want to work with, largely they are not going to be able to provide you with the reporting you want, usually the application processes, etc., in the way you want it, because of a variety of issues. Not being able to speak English, not being able to provide things written in a document format. And why I bring this up is the few good stories we have are usually facilitated. So we had the small grants program, as I mentioned earlier, of the GEF. The small grants program of the GEF in Egypt operates in the following way. Local NGOs that have to be registered apply with a specific theme. The most recent cycle was a climate cycle focused on adaptation projects. And you can approach an NGO that can apply for you, but very unlikely. It's usually going to be an NGO that represents a community or a certain challenge, or a big NGO that wants to work on a subject. Then you apply to the small grants program, which is the decision-making body of the small grants program is independent of the GIF. It's a body of civil society representatives, two representatives, I think, from UN organizations and a representative from the government. And they take a collective decision. In that sense, you could say that, oh, the decision-making here is very decentralized in a way. However, as I mentioned, first of all, the application process takes half a year. Second of all, you need to be registered as a nonprofit or an NGO, not a very easy thing. And you need to provide the proposal in a very specific format where it is easy for the average person who has received computerized education, but for others it isn't. So the small grants program have had some very good success stories working with small household farmers, fishermen in the Delta and in Alexandria, having an impact on few people in numbers, but given that you're also contributing $10,000 to $20,000, it is substantive. Especially the few examples the project has had in Kafr Sheikh, where the main issue we're facing is the increase and the need to shift or change the type of agricultural activity happening in the northern part of the Delta. Not necessarily focusing on coastal defenses, etc., more focusing on how agriculture can adapt. So I can note this as it worked out very well. We've have a few good cases in that, but it only worked because a local NGO applied to the grant and then facilitated the funds to a household farmer, or frontline household farmer. Now, I think there's a few now other examples. I think in Tunisia, I've come across an example on waste, and mitigating waste emissions or working more on waste. It was community based. I think if anyone has been following the situation in Tunisia as well, there's been a few things related to pollution and waste as well. But it was more starting from the community, going towards a community organization that can then come back to you with a project. I think this is, I don't personally have any experience with Morocco or Algeria or any other country in the region, but the trend is usually there even though it can start in a decentralized format, you will require some form of formalization. So the challenge in our region is we have a lot of informality, but we don't really acknowledge it in the formal system, meaning things are going to be centralized, even though there's a lot of informality. So the middleman that will bring things together is usually going to be the stakeholders who range from non-governmental to possibly governmental, but very rarely that actually happens. Finally, on how do you actually engage with women, children, indigenous people, other type of stakeholders as well that are not getting as much access? Well, it's a tough question. In most of our countries, I don't think we recognize the term indigenous, do other, you need to be careful in the terminology used. That's one. And two, my experience working with indigenous communities in North Africa has actually been quite positive. They have found their ways to get their funding. They have found their ways to get the support they need. They need more support because the nature of their living is different to usually how the country is operating. But one of the ways they've managed to do this is actually there's a growing international sort of, I would say, integration of indigenous needs. I would give a simple example of in Egypt, even though the government does not acknowledge the term indigenous, because in our constitution, everyone is Egyptian, so there can't be someone who's more Egyptian than another. But because we have Egypt, I think, has the most loans in Africa, because we have a lot of loan-based financing for projects. One of the projects, I'm not going to disclose the name of the project, because it was passing through an area where the cultural expert who did the survey determined that there's an area where there's an indigenous community. What you found here, and it's just publicly disclosed, is they had to find a way to become compliant with what is it called? The performance standards of the IFC for indigenous communities and how you consult them. So even though your constitution and your laws don't really acknowledge that terminology, you had to, because of the bank requirements, engage with that. And because of that engagement, that local community got access to one, first of all, recognition, two, job opportunities in the project during construction operation, and three, they became more aware of climate. It wasn't even on their radar too much, but then they're like, oh, climate change, maybe what's happening to us is relevant, let's explore this. It's fine if they perceive it as something that is, oh, there's an opportunity here for us to benefit from. That is okay, in my opinion. At least you're getting them engaged. I guess that's all I can share for now on experiences I've noted mainly in Egypt.
Well, thanks a lot. We have two questions in the chat box. For Zainab, do you think the Africa Credit Rating Agency would help cure the perceived high risk of Africa or North Africa in specific? And also, to all panelists that we have today, government side sovereignly and politically risk as a reason to centralize funds. So can you point to practical models where decentralized financing preserved national oversight yet delivered faster local outcomes? And what are the legal administrative steps made that possible? Yeah, please go ahead, Mohammed.
I'll jump quickly to the second question. So for the second question, I know we're looking for case studies, but what I can point out is you will find a trend in North Africa where all governments are starting to have their own national sovereign community funds, civil society funds, etc. I'm aware of this in Tunisia from 2015, Egypt as of last year, and I think Morocco as well, if I'm not mistaken. This is an acknowledgement from the North African governments that there is a need to decentralize funding, but at the same time, keeping it centralized at the very top in how the funds are sort of managed. So legal processes, I think it differs from one country to another, so I can't give a legal answer. But what I could say is, in terms of models, it had the majority that you will find that worked out are bottom up, and they're multi-stakeholder at the national level, not at the regional level. So multi-stakeholder, bottom up, and some form of trust-based mechanism used with government. So a local government or the national government itself.
Iskander, Zainab, would you like to comment on this?
I can comment on the first question on the credit rating. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the African credit rating can help but it's important to highlight it can help at some degree, only partially. It can help. How can it help? It can help because it can improve the accuracy of the risk assessment by using more local data, by being very close to reforms, and therefore able to understand the structural driver of the cost of capital in a way that is more nuanced. So it definitely can help correct that perception-based risk that the global agency, by being far, overstate in a way that's unfair. But it's also important to highlight that the local credit rating alone will not solve the entire of the problem. We also need to do more in terms of disclosing better data, having a stronger macroeconomic policies, demonstrating as well policy credibility. So together we can shift investors' behavior.
Thank you. Iskander, would you like to comment? Or we also have another question, if you'd like me to read it.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So to all the panelists, in your opinion, what would be an example of a promising, impactful financing mechanism in your country that works towards implementing the NDCs? You have something in mind that can help you? Thanks, Mai, for your question.
So I can first stab at this and then let others come in. I mean, I think it's clear, and it should be clear maybe from this discussion, that a good or an adequate mechanism for scaling climate finance in the context of a lot of these discussions around the creation of platforms for climate finance is one in which different actors in the ecosystem are able to come together, work better together, and solve for particular problems that require for different ways of doing things in order to unblock finance at scale. And I think one of the useful examples or the ideals for climate platforms, country platforms for climate-related investment that holds promise is the idea that it, in theory, creates the space for an honest dialogue between both project originators. So we're talking private sector companies that, particularly in the mitigation space, are bringing projects forward, but also the state with the role that it plays, with the national private finance sector, and then also the external finance that can be provided by MDBs, multilateral climate funds, and essentially the development partners in donor governments. And I think here it's interesting how if you are setting up an honest conversation, you can maybe try to recognize that there's no single fix that's going to fix everything, but it requires different things from different actors. So there are, in many cases, sectors of the economy that require reform, which is not a financial policy or tool or intervention per se, but it will create the environment for creating new markets for investment. On the other hand, you need to have an honest conversation about what are the if you're trying to set up a blended finance mechanism, what is the the requirement in terms of public finance, grant equivalent public finance, what is necessary from the development partners in terms of their contributions, given the fiscal constraints within developing countries that are, as in the North African context, facing quite severe expectations from their Gen Z and others in terms of healthcare and education investments at the same time. So that's the kind of I think approach that we need, where all actors can come to the table in a more genuine spirit of putting their problems on the table, and also being to be honest about their ability to bring forward solutions. I mean, we saw the example of the discussions in South Africa around the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, which is not the same as a country platform per se, but I think it provides us a very interesting and instructive example of what you might expect if you were to try to set up similar conversations around just energy transition in the North African context, given the issues and challenges that governments face in North Africa around transition, but also the challenges that the development partners face in actually bringing sufficient money to the table, as they failed to do in South Africa. So hopefully we can get to this kind of a more serious and mature conversation between the different actors in at some later date, although it's nowhere on the horizon, I think, in the immediate future.
Thank you, Iskander. Mohammed or Zainab, would you like to conclude as a final thought on this briefly?
Yeah, I can comment with like a concrete examples that I'm working on, which also constitutes a barrier to implementing NDCs in many African countries, which is currency risk. So basically, many climate projects, specifically in developing economies, need long-term financing, but often the loans that are coming are in dollars, and the revenues are in hard currency. The revenues are in local currency, which basically create this mismatch, right? The problem is that when the local currency depreciates, the repayment becomes more expensive, or for example, the hedging cost is very, very expensive, which makes the project very risky. And many NDC aligned project never reach the final close. So one practical solution we are doing, for example, is that I'm working very closely in Uganda with the Uganda Development Bank on putting in place a currency risk sharing model. So instead of saying UDB is going to carry all the FX depreciation risk on its balance sheets, which, as I mentioned, it's going to make the cost of capital very expensive, or it's going to limit the access of local currency financing on the borrower, the model is going to split the risk across different actors. So we say UDB is going to hold part of that exposure. Let's say, for example, between 0 to like 5% of depreciation risk is going to be on UDB, because that's actually the historical rate of depreciation. Anything between from 5 to like, I say, 90% is going to be held by a hedge provider. And what we call the tail end risk, or like the extreme depreciation, this is where the donor comes in and hold it. So basically what we're saying is that by reducing or sharing the risk, we can allow African local financial institution to provide more affordable, more local currency loans for NDC aligned projects. And this is basically a concrete example of successful African project that we are trying to put in place, in which also if we can, if it's successful, we can actually scale it up with the support of external actors like the NDPs, etc.
Thank you, Zainab. Sounds interesting. Mohammed, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes, sure. So I guess the final thing I could share is, I mean, we've had a very detailed discussion on access to finance and the challenges we're facing regarding this. Um, Unfortunately, I still don't see a financial landscape where there would be enhanced direct access for communities. I do see, though, that there is promising developments happening with regards to stakeholder involvement in financing. So I'll give an example. If anyone is following the multilateral environmental space, there was recently the Global Framework on Chemicals agreed earlier this year. And the Global Framework on Chemicals is a multi-stakeholder forum. And the fund itself that is going to, or the financial instrument within it, the fund that is going to provide financing for projects that are specifically focusing on assessing chemicals impact on the environment for certain types of chemicals is a multi-stakeholder fund, meaning that there needs to be different stakeholders coming in together from a national locality or several localities together to apply for projects. And we're seeing in Africa countries coming together. Egypt and Tunisia are looking at it. I think there's a few countries that are planning to apply together, and they're planning to include non-state actors as well in the application. This is, I would say, it's a promising start. Obviously, it's a non-binding framework anyway, but it's a promising start. And it could be interesting to see how something like this could evolve. For instance, that in its current stage doesn't actually require the non-state actors to be registered entities of some sort. So maybe that's something worth exploring, and it's an indicator that the sort of financial negotiations in different environmental spaces is starting to acknowledge the need for multi-stakeholder engagement and enhanced access.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks all for your presentations today. They were very insightful and wonderful, engaging discussions. I hope all of our audience enjoyed today. And lastly, I would like to give the floor to Charles, who can conclude our session from ARIN.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for joining this webinar. And Amram, it's a great pleasure that you have really moderated excellently. I'm Charles Tanui. I'm an engagement and partnership coordinator at the Africa Research and Impact Network. And I must say that you're persistent and in terms of the discussions, the panelists, you have really shared quite substantive insights. And the role of ARIN is really to create this platform to have Africa sustain the peer-to-peer learning and really trace the knowledge, the evidence, they co-produce the evidence and shape the conversations, including the climate action agenda. Now, just to close so that I don't really repeat and dilute what you have really presented, which has been really quite substantive. One, I think that is something that we need to really strengthen as Africa in terms of moving forward is to build the data system or the base of the real primary ingredient to really support us in developing bankable and fundable investments that will really help us to achieve those ambitions which within the NDCs. And I was really looking at, and you've been having this conversation, how many countries in Africa, not only North Africa, who have built the data centers that are really, can really support that. And in Morocco is really emerging in the global north. In North Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, they compose half of the data centers in Africa. So it really tells us that there is more investment that is needed in building data centers that can really capture, store, and analyze disaggregated data, considering our complex or heterogeneity when it comes to building adaptation systems. Secondly, I was lucky to be part of the experts who are under the UAE PLM program on indicators, and we did substantive work in reviewing close to 10,000 indicators which were adopted, 100 were adopted for further review, 149 for further review at the SP 62, and then 59 were adopted at the Parliament. And now these indicators came at the time a number of countries that submitted the NDCs, and some they've not submitted. For instance, Morocco and Tunisia submitted the third generation of NDCs. And then Egypt, we have Sudan, Algeria, who have not submitted the revised NDCs. But what implication to the indicators on the implementation of the NDCs? So it means for those countries which have submitted, there is need to relook at the targets within the NDCs and already the adopted indicators, so that we can really align. And in terms of reporting, we have got consistent reporting in terms of how far are we in terms of achieving adaptation towards the GGA, but also meeting the NDC targets. The opportunities are also there for the countries who have not submitted revised NDCs to still align with also the indicators adopted at COP30. But of course, the Belém Addis vision is giving us also an opportunity that in the next 2 years, there'll be a refinement. And this is an opportunity also for learning, particularly looking at the priority indicators and along the 7 sectors and also the dimensional targets. Now, third is we have discussed very strongly the blended and innovating financing. And in February, I was at the OECD and we were interacting close to 400 investors. And there was a conversation, particularly on blended finance. It's bringing in more of private sector, but the risk that comes with the private sector is the appetite for risk, meaning that private sector has got that tendency of transferring 100% risk to the beneficiaries. But now, when you talk of the blended and innovative financing, and also borrowing from the commitment and the positions at the Seville conference, is that we need to really strengthen the policy framework around public-private partnership, so that you can have the small, medium, and small entrepreneurs really be brought to the level that are really cushioned from the appetite for profit, and also really observing all the risk from the private financing. And of course, lastly is we need, as Africa now, especially the North Africa, considering its economic and also the ability to still manage, sustain the growth in terms of partnering also with the other African countries and consolidate, of course, using the platforms like the Africa Free Trade Agreement, whereby products out of the climate smart agriculture are really added value so that it can attract more private, friendly, flexible investments into Africa. Otherwise, thank you very much, and we look forward to sustain conversation in 2026, and of course, because there'll be second phase of the webinars, and we look forward to really engage more, because we are going to focus on the private, mobilizing private sector financing. Thank you very much, and back to you, Washington, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you.
Maham, over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Charles, for this really insightful conclusions. And thank you all, and apologies for the delayed ending of the session, but it's all because of the really interesting discussions that we have distilled today. So yeah, thanks all, and looking forward to collaborating more on this. Obviously, we still need more conversations on climate finance in North Africa in particular, and in Africa in general. And yeah, I wish to see you all in Uganda, maybe. Okay. Thank you,
Thank
and
you.
wish you a good weekend.
Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Enjoy.
Thanks all.
Bye.